Good morning and welcome to our audience. Thank you for registering for our panel discussion on state capture and its impact on U.S.-Africa relations. I'd like to welcome all of you who have attended previous programs and any of our new attendees. This is part of a series of programs from the Africa program of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We much appreciate you joining us. I would like to point out that while these programs are free to you, the audience, they're not free for us to stage. And so we would definitely appreciate any support that any of you would like to give to keep the program going and enable us to do more of these. You are encouraged, if you have questions of any member of the panel, to please put them in the Q&A boxes at the bottom of your screen. It's somewhere about the halfway point or after we will take questions from the audience. I would like to introduce our moderator for today. This is a special program and a special treat. Our moderator will be Miss Anita Powell, who's a White House correspondent and who has been a journalist covering Africa from her base in South Africa for a number of years, quite experienced in Africa issues. And I will let her introduce the program and the panel. Anita, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Let me just get right to it and introduce our wonderful panel today. We're going to be talking about state capture, and I'm going to start with FPRI's Michael Walsh. He's a non-resident senior fellow in the Africa program, and he's a regular commentator on Africa and Near Eastern affairs. And he advises companies, governments, nonprofits, and he always speaks to journalists, for which we are always grateful. So thank you for joining us, Michael. We're going to talk about Southern Africa with you today. Next, we have Robert Benson, who is our Europe expert, and he's a senior policy analyst for national security and international policy at American Progress, although I realize it's an American institution, I should call it Progress. And then Nancy Ries is a professor emerita at Colgate University, and I asked her to join us today because she took a really novel look at state capture in her construct of a different mode of state capture, which we're going to talk about. She calls it thugocracy. And then finally, if I may, Ambassador, I just want to make sure we introduce our host, Ambassador Charles Ray. He's an FPRI trustee. He chairs the Africa program, and he opened the first U.S. consulate in Ho Chi Minh City. He was ambassador to Cambodia and Zimbabwe. He held diplomatic posts in Sierra Leone, China, and Thailand, and he was Deputy Secretary of Defense for POW and missing personnel, I believe. So he comes to us with great experience, and I have to add, he has written more than 250 works of fiction and nonfiction. So I really thank him for finding time to be with us today. I want to just get right to it because I was interested in talking about state capture because it's a phenomenon that I observed as a journalist in South Africa for about 12 years, very recently. So I want to ask you, if you don't mind, Michael, starting with you, just to sketch out your case study of state capture and remind us one of the most important things, I think, is who lost, who was impacted negatively by state capture. So Michael, please, over to you.
No, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I mean, when you look at state capture and you look at what's happened in South Africa over the last couple of decades, really since the end of apartheid, when we talk about state capture and what is state capture, you talked about observing state capture. We don't always observe state capture. I think that's what makes South Africa such an interesting case, is that everyone did observe state capture in South Africa. And part of that was because there were investigations and there was still an independent judiciary that had the ability to investigate and to be able to publish and to be able to document what was going on. There was still a media that was functioning in South Africa that had the ability to do that. And so you had, the ability to observe state capture. And when we talk about what state capture means in the context of South Africa, we often talk about the shadow state. And that really came out of a series of investigations, including the betrayal of promise. That's really recent. I mean, when you look at the investigations, we knew state capture was happening in South Africa long before, the end of the 2010s. But that's when we really started getting strong empirical evidence coming out through actual government institutions and through civil society. And it's the evidence that really matters, because the evidence is ultimately, in the case of South Africa, what really changed the game and led to an effort to really try to recapture the state back. And when you talk about who suffers, it's the collective good that ultimately suffers. You know, anytime you have a small group that takes advantage of state institutions for their own benefit, and this happens in every government around the world to some extent, right? It's really about the spectrum. It's about how far you go down the road, right? And so when we start talking about state capture, I mean, it's egregious at that point. It's extreme. So it's in the extremists. So that's what we start talking about state capture. But state capture ultimately is about having a small group of individuals repurposing the state for their own interests. And when that happens, it becomes institutionalized. And so once it becomes institutionalized, it's very hard to change it, even if you have political will to change it, even if you have awareness to change it. But in the case of South Africa, you could see that you know, there was a pushback. There has been, and it isn't just, I mean, people like to say, you know, that the elections that happened last year show that, you know, people were going after one particular political party. The political party was running the show and they were involved, but the reality is there were people in the ANC who were also trying to push back against state capture. So there isn't a way to generalize and say that everyone in a certain group is pro state capture. That's not the case. And so I think South Africa is just such a complicated story to tell, but it's such an important story to tell. And to get back to the point I made at the very beginning, it's because there was empirical evidence. It was because there was a way to point to it and say, this is not a subjective opinion of one individual. This is objective. This is happening. And we can see it happening. And here's why it's happening. Now, when you look at what's happening in the United States today, in contrast to that, you know, we had the remarks that were made by the Prime Minister of Spain yesterday about Silicon Valley, and he criticized and he said, you know, there's this techno caste that's taking over, and that they need to be pushed back against. You know, that narrative is a different type of narrative that's happening, and that's the invisible, the hidden side of state capture. At least that's the claim, that's the argument that's being made. You're seeing people, especially in Europe and other places, making this argument that there's state capturing happening well beyond the cases that we're going to talk about today. It's happening in real time in front of us. And that's being pushed back against, because the debate that's happening on that level about state capture, you know, the other side of it says that actually what's happening is, you know, ensuring that civil liberties and freedoms are being guaranteed, and that social media is an important part of that dynamic, and that we have to have freedom of speech. And so what the people who are arguing that there is this caste or this state capture happening in the West are actually against free speech, or against civil liberties, or against all of these things that we hold dear for our own values. And so that's, I think, the U.S. case right now, and the one that's starting to emerge in this debate that's starting to happen, this discourse that's starting to happen, is actually going to be a much harder state capture debate to have than the case of South Africa, because South Africa is a retrospective case where there was a ton of evidence, and it's very easy to point at it and say state capture happened there. The current debates that are happening, they're happening in real time, and they're very political, and it's a very different environment. And so I don't think there's a really strong corollary, but they're all part of this state capture studies, I guess, that's emerging, and something we're looking at.
I really like that you point out, incidentally, that this is a case of a post-mortem diagnosis. And just like a post-mortem diagnosis, it is performed by a doctor. I mean, the Commission of Inquiry in South Africa and the public protector laid this out in excruciating detail. But let's move away from South Africa to its neighbor. Ambassador, can you talk to us about what you witnessed as an ambassador and working in these, you know, in these many settings, especially in Zimbabwe and also in Cambodia, vis-a-vis state capture?
Thank you. Yeah, and part of it, I think, you know, Michael hit on it when he talked about the fact that state capture is easier to define for people post-mortem. It becomes a little more difficult when you're living in the midst of it, and there's a tendency I saw a tendency in both cases when I was ambassador to Cambodia and ambassador to Zimbabwe, is there were so many that people tended to point to those other factors rather than to what was happening, and that is a small group of people, as Michael alluded to, had basically captured the institutions of state and were exploiting them for personal benefit to the detriment of the greater society. In Zimbabwe, for example, one of the issues, and the issue itself was never fully understood, was ethnic tensions there. There's the two major ethnic groups in Zimbabwe, the Shona and the Ndebele, who have unresolved conflicts that date back to before European colonization, which historians, which the Zimbabweans themselves have never really sat down and figured out. And that actually complicated the whole issue of state capture. For example, after independence, you had the two forces, ZANU, which is primarily a Shona organization, and ZAPU, which was in Ndebele. And there was this conflict between the two over who would have primacy in controlling the state. And a lot of focus was on the violence. Little focus was on the fact that there was a deliberate effort on the part of both to get control of economic institutions, the farms. I mean, this was the issue that led to the sanctions against Zimbabwe. Was ZANU-PF, which came out at on top in the food fight in the 1980s, was basically taking control of the farms, of the factories, and of the other income generating institutions in the country. And they were using that money not for the benefit of the country as a whole, but to benefit themselves and to stay in power to benefit their allies.
Can I ask you? Yeah,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well,
I wanted to ask you about the effect of external pressure in the form of sanctions. That was a big part of the state capture story in Zimbabwe. Do you think that helped, or that?
No, it didn't help. And in fact, what sanctions did, because of the way they were managed, is that it gave the offenders in ZANU-PF propaganda material that they used to basically, and it's misinformation, but to pull the people into their corner, all at the same time they were exploiting them. The sanctions were put in place in response to some real grievances. I mean, there were efforts to thwart democracy. There was violence, but the sanctions were meant to, or at least a stated reason was to change their behavior. 10 years after the fact, when I went there as ambassador, not one behavior had changed. But at the same time, not one, well, and I take that back, some behavior had changed, but the sanctions weren't modified to reflect that. I mean, I walked into an embassy, and when the sanctions list was put on my desk and I reviewed it, I mean, there were 12 or 13 dead people on the list. And this undercuts your credibility like it's unbelievable. And you have the propagandists of ZANU-PF saying they're sanctioning dead people. There were people whose behavior had clearly changed and who'd become, quote, enemies of the regime, who were still on the sanctions list. So,
in short, it's not an effective tool, is what you're trying to say.
It's a totally ineffective. Well, it's an effective tool for the guy you're sanctioning, because he can point to these inconsistencies and say, this is when they say sanctions are hurting the economy. And they use these basically examples of our sanctions are, again, sanctioning dead people. We're sanctioning the agricultural bank, which hurts the farmers, and no one's behavior has changed. That is a tool used by the opposition. So
this is fascinating. I want to move on to Robert, because I want to go a little further into the other side of the globe. Robert, you argue in your work that the case of state capture in Hungary, the loser here is the transatlantic alliance, that this has knock-on effects. Can you go ahead and sketch out what you believe is happening in Hungary, but also why you think that this is the case?
Thanks, Anita. I think that's absolutely right. This is a geopolitical catastrophe in the making. Let's take it back to what we saw on Monday with the inauguration, right? We had this billionaire oligarch caste in the back row, acting almost as a shadow cabinet to Trump's incoming officials, right, in Washington. So the image itself was stark, but it was also complemented by a raft of far-right zealots who made the trip overseas, principally from Europe, in support of this MAGA revolution in the United States. And I'm not talking simply about Boris Johnson or Giorgia Meloni, people who you would ordinarily think of when you think of the populist far right in Europe. But I'm talking about lesser known, far more radical figures which have flown under the radar. Santiago Abascal in Spain, who is the leader of the Vox party. Tino Tripula, who is the co-leader of the AfD, an ascendant neo-Nazi party in Germany, which Musk coincidentally a couple of weeks ago had tweeted out his endorsement of, completely and totally upending German politics. As of yesterday, Olaf Scholz at Davos said that Musk constituted a threat to the constitutional order of the German Republic. These aren't games. This is serious business. And the Commission in the EU has most definitely taken note. It's not only Sanchez, as Michael pointed out, who has indicated the threat that this caste of oligarchs poses to the relationship between the United States and Europe, but it's also people like President Macron in France, who have time and time again said that Europe now needs strategic autonomy, that it cannot rely on the United States as a partner in a global democratic order. Because the thing about state capture is that it corrodes democracy. You can't understand state capture without understanding it as a mechanism of democratic decay. It's a hollowing out of our institutions, which then takes me back to places like Hungary. You have these MAGA-like political organizations, political parties, right, which in many respects predate Trump. Trump is learning from them. You have this autocratic diffusion across the Atlantic, where people like Steve Bannon are holding these far-right jamborees, inviting Orban's Fidesz or Robert Fico's SMER smear party to essentially trade notes in how best to manipulate the populations, capture institutions, undermine due process, co-opt judicial bodies, and seize the mechanisms of the state in order essentially to render any opposition, be it civil society opposition, be it the media, or be it institutional opposition, completely and totally moot. This is dangerous. And it's dangerous both on a domestic political level in terms of our politics in the United States and politics in Hungary, Poland, and Germany, but then also externally in terms of how we relate to each other internationally. It is nothing short of a crumbling of the international order happening in real time. That's the fundamental contention.
Wow, we can go into some of the details of that, but I want to throw it now to Nancy, because Nancy has come up with a really interesting construct that she calls thugocracy. Nancy, can you please sketch that out for us? And let me just be clear. When you call this thugocracy, that is not a legal determination. That is not a conviction. And none of the characters who you mention in your scholarship have ever been convicted of things related to, racketeering or anything like that. These are allegations that have flown for years in the American political sphere and also in the two countries that you described. So Nancy, if you could take it away and talk to us about thugocracy, which I also have to add, in some circles, is considered high praise. I did invite Tupac Shakur to attend today. I don't know if he's with us. Hi, Pac. But in some circles, the thug life is something admirable. So take us through your vision of thugocracy, please.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to talk about thugocracy here today, Anita. I come to that concept after nearly 40 years of doing ethnographic field work on the ground in Moscow, political anthropology projects, one after the other, where from the late 1980s on, I was able to, in some cases, actually engage with mafia organizations and what Russians call bandits, banditi, as they slowly over time worked with government officials and the rising business class that was rapidly privatizing the common weal of the Soviet Union. And that kind of goes back to what Charles Ray was talking about in Zimbabwe and Southern Africa, where the privatization process was instrumentalized by all kinds of actors using banditism, using mafia violence to basically allow them to capture state resources of every kind, especially in the earlier days, natural resources, factories, and so on. And I've watched over all of these decades through the 80s, the chaotic years of the 90s in Russia, where I did a lot of field work, and then through the Putin 25 years, basically from 2000 on, as the state has congealed around thugocratic methods whereby government officials themselves keeping a distance from mafia bandits and assassins and so on, nevertheless utilize the tools, the mechanisms, the personnel, and the networks of mafias in order to carry out capture of first of the resources of state, but gradually in a kind of descending curtain of autocracy with a very clear, that you can see in retrospect, clear playbook of how to do this, of capturing resources and industrial capacity, but then capturing the media, as has happened in the Russian Federation, capturing all of the instruments of civil society, capturing academic institutions, in some cases, as in Hungary, actually expelling really world-renowned institutions from Hungary, as happened with the CEU. Capturing, slowly capturing all of the instruments of communication. And in the Russian cases, I think is well known, this has been accomplished through a combination of lawfare and actual physical violence. And 250 journalists are estimated to have been killed over 20 years in the Russian Federation, not to mention figures like political figures like Navalny. So state capture through mafiaization, and a Hungarian scholar, Balint Magyar, who I'm sure Robert Benson knows really well, have described this as the creation of mafia states, whereby those in power utilize mafia type or thugocratic, as I call them, methods and means to intimidate, to squash civil society, to silence opposition. And in the Russian case and many other cases across the former Soviet world and throughout the world, using violence to do that. We don't see in the United States the use of violence, but we are hearing thugocratic discourse, the discourse of threat, the discourse that says deport them, as happened to the bishop yesterday. That's thugocratic discourse. It's accompanied by thugocratic ideologies, and that far right thugocracies, I think, are a key part of how that's sort of globalizing this whole phenomenon.
Thank you all for sketching that out. I want to ask you a really quick hit pop quiz question, which amounts to, what can democracies like our own learn from the lessons of state capture in other countries? But also, if you had to tell just one institution or one person if you had to give them advice on how to couch against state capture, on how to combat state capture, who would you reach out to and what would you tell them? And I think I'm going to, as a point of personal privilege, throw it to the ambassador first. Ambassador, what advice do you have for countries, for other democracies viewing this case, and who do you think should take the lead or could take the lead in working against state capture?
Sorry, I was muted. That is a tantalizing question that cannot be answered simply, because it takes, you know, the old saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it takes a village to save a village. And I think that there's no single institution or single individual that can resist state capture. It takes a lot of organizations and a lot of people working together. One of the biggest things, though, is protecting the information flow and stemming misinformation. And that's true whether you're in a place like Zimbabwe or in a place like the United States. I mean, we like to think that here in the US, you know, we're better educated and we're smarter. But the fact is that if you follow the public discourse, if you watch comments on social media, you'll find that we're no different from any other large population. We have a lot of quite stupid people, and we have a lot of naive people who are selecting their news sources, their information sources, and tuning out things that they disagree with, which makes them prime targets for disinformation. And so
you believe the key is in educating the public or informing
the public and
right.
getting and making sure that there are a lot of voices. I mean, people worry about information overload. I worry about information rerouting. I mean, the fact that people are getting their information through just one pipe when they should be getting conflicting views and be educated to be critical thinkers, to compare those views and come up with logical decisions. So I would say, you know, one of the issues, and this probably runs a counter to the whole idea of freedom and capitalism, but allowing our media sources to be owned by the super wealthy and not sort of more people-oriented media is one problem right there. I mean, I have nothing against rich people, but wealthy people, in my experience, their first thought is protecting their wealth. And when wealthy people own news sources and news sources are threatened by authoritarian governments, the wealthy have a tendency to cave to protect their investment. And we need to figure a way to I won't say to completely get rid of that, because that would be becoming like the thugs we're trying to fight, but some way of having really democratic news sources for people to get their information from.
Michael, I want to throw,
well, I was saying, and a lot of it has to go to the people. We as people, we as citizens, also have to take responsibility for educating ourselves. We
Michael,
really have
I want to take us to South Africa, Michael, because I want to talk about the role of institutions like the media and also the legal institutions in educating the public about state capture. And I don't want to leave out of this discussion the fact that the state capture scenario, the case in South Africa, was a great story in that you had airplanes landing at military bases, you had lavish weddings at resorts, you had all sorts of shenanigans, for lack of a better word, which made it actually a really interesting, compelling story to tell that captivated South African imagination, because we're talking about a country where, you know, literacy levels, access to media are not what they are in the United States. And yet that story was told. So what advice do you have to countries or to democracies that might be facing this challenge?
I think, first of all, South Africa is an independent state, but we have to look at subnational governments as well. And even in South African case, you know, you had to actually dissect it. So in the United States, we have single party states where no one can challenge. If you're either a Republican or you're a Democrat, and that's just the way it is. When you have single party states in a democracy, it becomes easier to capture the state because all you have to do is capture your own party. And so I think that's why the South Africa case is just sort of the exemplar. It's so easy, but actually it's a bad exemplar because a lot of places around the world where state capture exists, there isn't a single party dominant state. Sometimes it can happen across parties. And those ones are more difficult to actually observe and to understand the dynamics that are happening behind the scenes. And so to go back to your earlier question of Ambassador Ray about who would you speak to, I would speak to academics in the media. I think if you listen to the first half of this webinar, you would think that it's a Republican problem because of the case study that Robert mentioned, right? And from a US perspective, right? But it isn't a Republican thing, it isn't a Democratic thing. State capture is about a small group of individuals wielding the power of state institutions to benefit themselves. And that could be Democrats, it could be Republicans, it could be any political party in the world can do that, right? It's a group of people who are
And
using
indeed, as you bring up, both President Biden and President Trump have accused each other of some of these behaviors for years in the lack of convictions of either of them. So yeah, no, you're right. It's not a politicized problem.
And I think there's really good case studies that get overlooked all the time. The state of Hawaii, I mean, you actually have independent journalism, which was by a wealthy person, funded by a wealthy person, who made Civil Beat possible. Civil Beat has been a huge force in actually exposing corruption in the state of Hawaii and holding political leaders accountable. And had Civil Beat not existed, I seriously doubt that the majority of residents of the state of Hawaii would ever have any idea what was going on in our state. And so, when I look at that case study and I look at that, I mean, you talked about interesting stories in South Africa. I always tell people, I mean, having lived a lot of my adult life in the state of Hawaii and just being involved in things back there, coming from South Africa, going to school in South Africa, living in South Africa, and coming to Hawaii and seeing the dynamics that happen in both states politically. We had a senior senator in the state of Hawaii who got literally caught with a bag of money and went to jail. We had, senior people in law enforcement, senior people in justice at the state level. We basically had to have an attorney general from the US government assigned to investigate cases in the state of Hawaii to hold people accountable. It all happened during the pandemic, so a lot of people weren't aware. But I think that's part of the problem. To get to your question of Ambassador Ray is, who do you talk to? If we only talk about state capture in the context of the far right, or we only talk about state capture in the context of, the ANC and liberation movements in Africa, then we're missing actually a wider context, but we're also feeding into people's biases because people are listening to us and they if they're not of the same mindset as the person who they're listening to talking about this specific case, then they're rejecting the whole notion of it all. And they're saying, state capture doesn't exist, or that state capture actually isn't that bad. And so I think that the biggest problem we have on the state capture literature is the fact that South Africa is an easy case, so everyone talks about it. Everyone talks about the far right in Europe, and a ton of other cases are just overlooked or not discussed or not focused on. And so what you end up having is a highly sort of selection bias in the cases that we look at in the media and in academia, which leads to the general public and other people who are in academia who look at this saying that, it is biased. And so therefore it's not credible or not legitimate, or the people who are saying this have an ulterior motive. And I think we really do need to look at why there is so much selection bias from the media and from academia in the cases that we look at, because if we expanded it, I think it would be a much more effective argument.
That's a lot of food for thought. I want to move to Robert and to Nancy, and I do pose that same question to you, but with you, I also want to talk about what you've observed in your case studies vis-a-vis the use of ethnic or gendered rhetoric by the captains of state capture, by those who are in charge. Is that a feature or is that a bug in your view? And what advice do you have for societies that are dealing with that. Who would like to go first, Robert or Nancy? Nancy, please go ahead.
Anita, thank you for letting me go first on this. One of the most striking things that observers of the Russian Federation and the Putin era takeover of everything is the role of the attacks on LGBTQ movements and individuals and imagery from the very beginning of that project. And I often think of this as the wedge issue or the point of the sword issue, that the criminalization and demonization of LGBTQ persons and movements in Russia has led the way for a lot of other anti-civil society, anti-diversity movements. And so there you see a transnational movement or set of identities or liberation project being targeted as being the most dangerous, the most, as Putin or other Russian leaders would call it, the most demonic category of social identity. From that also flows an attack on anything that looks like gender diversity or feminism. So feministki are demonized in the in Russian authoritarian discourse, and so misogyny, traditionalism, and then, of course, a sort of broad nationalism, which is at its heart race.
I just have to add that in the Russian Federation, there is a list of 250 jobs that women are not allowed to do. Like, this is bolstered by the force of law.
Yes, some of that was as a carryover of Soviet law, where women were protected from dangerous jobs, but those kinds of laws and movements and discourses and ideologies have been profoundly resurgent in the under the Putin regime, and are even even more ascendant since the full-on invasion of Ukraine. So gender diversity becomes part of the transnational attack. So Ukraine is demonized as being a place of, that is comfortable for LGBTQ communities. And that's used again as this point of the sword ideologically to convince the Russian population that Ukraine is demonic. And there are many examples where you can see state figures talking about demonic Ukraine that harbors LGBTQ activists or that allows trans people to flourish. So these things, I think the gender ideology, the misogyny is part of thugocracy. It's a kind of masculinist movement where the politics of masculinism are utilized because they are so powerful and because they kind of transcend every level of scale, from the transnational, the national, to the very personal. So they reach into people's personal lives.
Robert, I want to ask you to take it from there. What have you seen in your observations in the European space? And also, is there an ethnic element or some sort of nationalist element to this as well, in addition to the gendered element?
Where to begin? Posing phenomenal questions and to the panelists. Thank you so much. What a pleasure it is to be with all of you here. If I may, maybe just replying to Michael, I welcome your call to expand the aperture. I think it's absolutely necessary not to hyperfocus on the far right. I also think, looking at examples in Latin America, right? The Chavista movement in Venezuela, what we see with the Maduro government. I mean, Anne Applebaum's book on Autocracy, Inc., I think does an excellent job connecting the dots between the malfeasance of the far right and that of the far left. I also fundamentally question really the utility of even thinking in terms of left and right for this, because at a certain point, it doesn't really serve us well. What we have here is really power and access run amok. But just parking that for a moment and maybe picking up where Nancy left off, in 2018, when the CEU, the Central European University, was run out of Budapest by Fidesz, I was there. And it wasn't as if the university was occupied by brown shirts and professors were being dragged out of their offices in some kind of violent spectacle. That's not what it was. This was done through legal means, judiciously, which gets to the first question that Anita poses: what to look out for? Autocratic legalism, right? State capture is aided and abetted through legal processes, the veneer of legalism. Danny Zablat and Steve Levitsky in their book How Democracy Dies, I mean, I think they sum it up quite nicely. They write that it's the letter of the law being used to violate the spirit of the law. So you have these processes which on paper have gone through the appropriate mechanisms, but are undoing constitutional checks, undermining the independence of independent state bodies, right? And weakening democracy while at the same time abetting cronyism, giving access to, systems of party patronage, so forth. Who do we talk to, right? If I had a message to give, who would be the group of people I would seek to talk to? And maybe, Michael, this is where you and I diverge. I would talk to the Republicans. I talk to the Republican Senate. I'll put on my political science hat here. And we know that when state capture happens and is aided and abetted by a single political party, that party has tremendous power to slow that process. This is not what we saw with Fidesz. Fidesz was absolutely in lockstep with Viktor Orban. Kaczynski's Law and Justice was in lockstep with PIS in Poland until they were finally booted from power about 2 years ago. The Republican Party has an obligation to put country over a cult of personality and to show a degree of courage in some of the fights that we will have in the next 4 years. Even more so than the Democratic Party, which is fulfilling a function of a loyal opposition, right? The Democratic Party will do what it has to do. It will oppose the agenda. But it's really the Republican Party which has a constitutional obligation to ensure that these excesses of power, right? Undermining the 14th Amendment, birthright citizenship. I mean, has a single Republican senator spoken out? We can't normalize this, right? So that would be my message. And finally, I do apologize if it's a bit scatterbrained here. I'm attempting to go sequentially, but the question of gender is fundamentally important here, right? This idea of a masculine machismo, right? To take the Latin American case, is imbricated with power, right? With access, with this idea that mediating institutions don't matter, right? I'm simply going to get done what I need to get done, be damned to checks and balances. This is a very masculine way of approaching the world and a very dangerous way of doing so. And we can look at our gender scholar colleagues who have done a fantastic job pointing that out and giving us fair warning. So I think I put quite a bit on the table, so I can pause there, but thank you.
I really appreciate that. You have given me so much to think about, but I want to go to Ambassador Ray now and kind of wrap this up so we have an opportunity for people to ask questions. I want to ask you about the role of state capture in the civil service. As we all know, Ambassador Ray has served his country for many years, so he might be poised to talk about this. But what did you see in Zimbabwe or in Cambodia or any other case samples you would like to cite about the role of state capture on civil servants?
Well, yeah, I'd first like to point out that I totally agree with the comment about this right versus left. The state capture and the destruction of state institutions is not a right or left phenomena. It's a question of a lust for power and control. And I like Robert's comment there. That's unfortunately a very masculine thing. And I think that plays a lot into it. What I saw in in a number of countries, but most notably in Zimbabwe, which was my last assignment before I retired from government, and in Cambodia, is that in addition to controlling or neutralizing the media, one of the things that the small group of people, and by the way, in both cases, Zimbabwe and in Cambodia, you couldn't characterize the governments that were, or the groups that were running things, as being rightist. I mean, they were supported by, in both cases, in fact, China, and had some very leftist tendencies in both countries. For example, a lot of the old hands in government, and especially the ones who were part of the group running things, still referred to each other as comrade. They still had party cells and central committees. So this was really a very leftist state capture phenomenon. And the thing that I noticed, that in both cases, after sort of neutralizing the media, their second priority was to gain influence and control over, one, the military and other security forces, but also, and this gets missed in a lot of our sanctions and a lot of our comments from government about it, is controlling key government institutions that provide service to the public, the key permanent secretaries and key clerks, to ensure that government services are provided in a tactical or strategic, targeted way to those people that they want to gain support from. And essentially what happens is that the government service becomes the personal service of the thugs. I mean, basically, we're talking thugs, convicted or not. You don't have to be convicted to be a thug. I grew up around a lot of unconvicted thugs. The fact is that a small group of people, not for political purposes, but for self-aggrandizement, seize control of all of the organs of government and target them for one purpose and one purpose only, and that's maintaining their control. And the civil service becomes either co-opted or completely neutralized and useless.
Michael, can I throw to you for the South Africa experience here? We heard, I mean, the most egregious example of co-opting of institutions in South Africa was probably the scene in the Shebeen in Saxonwold, where Mbisi Jonas was offered a cabinet position. And his account of state capture was, you know, you put your caters in the places that you want, and then it's easy after that. Can you just talk us through how the civil service was impacted in South Africa and how that might be used as a tool of state capture?
So you had a stratification of the civil service. What you saw is that you could, at a very young age, without a lot of experience, be thrust up into high levels within institutions if you had connections, if you could be put in place. You could circumnavigate the traditional recruitment, development, going up the grades system. And, you know, I think that that's an interesting question about, you know, talent and capability versus time and grade. And one of the major criticisms of the function of democracy is that democracy fails because people who are innovative, people who are talented, people who could rise quickly can't within the system. And so one of the counter arguments against this, which is one of the things that enables state capture, is that people say that state itself is inefficient and they want this masculine approach that Robert is saying is a negative. A lot of people see it as a positive. And that's the dichotomy in all of this. And you know, Ambassador Ray talked about people who were uneducated, but there's also a lot of people who are poor, and those people haven't benefited from the state. The state hasn't delivered for them. It hasn't delivered the services. And so they're disenfranchised by the state. And so, you know, I think that there's this tension between people who have actually captured states, making the argument that, the way we fix this is by letting me put people in who can fix it and let me circumnavigate the system because the system is broken. And that is what enables this whole thing to happen. So I think that, understanding the context of two things, understanding the context that enables state capture in the first place, and I talked about single party democracies. I think there's a strong correlation there because once you have one party, it's easier. But I think there's a lot of other factors. I think we desperately need to understand holistically the factors more that enable state capture, that provide a permittable environment for state capture to occur. I think we understand some of them really well. I don't think we have a really holistic view of them. And I think some of them are very context sensitive, and I think that's the problem. But I would say the other issue with all of this is that once state capture occurs, because we talked about how it's easy to see in retrospect, but it's hard to see happening in real time, we need to actually understand what the dimensions of state capture are, the practical dimensions, so that we can then start to monitor and have metrics and understand how democracies are functioning so that we actually can produce real-time evidence. If we don't understand all of the processes and sub-processes, some of which are innovative and novel and they change, right? So they're not always consistent. But those are the things that, doing multi-context studies and being able to pull out the variables and be able to isolate all of these things helps us to understand when it's happening in the future. And so to your point about the civil service in South Africa, once people can start jumping the ladder very quickly without having potentially the educational background or having the experience or having that, that might be a sign that state capture is occurring. And so that's something to look out for. But the counter to that is that, some people would argue that that's also what's needed. And so that there's the tension.
I could ask you all questions all day, but for now, I want to throw it to the audience. But any final thoughts before we do that? Ambassador, do you have anything that you want to add very briefly before we throw it to questions?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we've said is fascinating, and it points out the need for a better educated public. One of the things, for example, I mean, Michael mentioned sort of looking at the nuance, and it's a good point that people make these changes in this capture because the government's not working the way it should, and they convince people to support them, and then they proceed to not work the way it should, and their supporters are left holding the bag. But it just keeps repeating itself, and somehow we need to improve the study of history and flow of information so that people can make these connections. And
would anyone else like to offer some final thoughts? It sounds like Nancy has something. Go ahead.
Just thinking about things that Ambassador Ries said, and I think Michael Walsh said this early on in the webinar, one of the things that happens, and I saw this in Russia and I'm seeing it in the United States right now, is that when there's a real surge of state capture happening, the sense that the public has is of chaos and overwhelmedness. And I think many of us might be feeling this in the last couple of days, that so many things are happening all at once that it's incredibly hard to get a handle on it. And public education and public awareness, as happened in South Africa, where the very vocabulary of state capture actually exists as a public tool. That's incredibly important, and yet also really hard to happen in real time when so many things are going on at once. But I think what Michael Walsh made this point early on, that local small scale media outlets, investigation, legal investigation and so forth can be incredibly important, so that a sort of more local focus, local scale, local consciousness and local engagement can be really helpful. And that can be local within an institution or an institutional network, or local in the geographic sense. I think that's critically important, and also gives people a sense of being able to grab hold of what's happening.
As a former City Hall reporter myself, I am going to stand up for for the value of local journalism, and it is a tough job, and I agree that it needs to be diffused across the system. Robert, would you like to add anything?
So this is not my own independent thought, but I will channel another thinker in the authoritarian space, that being Tim Snyder, who often says, "Don't obey in advance," right? So it's important when going through moments of state capture, or I would suggest possibly even democratic backsliding writ large, not to cede, right, to would-be authority figures in advance. So this can be locally, right, within your municipalities, within states, right, fighting back against encroachments. It can be at the national level, right? And it runs the gamut from civil society through, right, academic institutions, the media. It's concerning when George Stephanopoulos gives a $15 million payout with ABC in advance, right, to the Trump team. That's concerning. This is the kind of stuff that we see happening in the post-Soviet sphere, right? I'm sure that Nancy would have ample examples. So I'd end by that humble plea that we hold firm against clear encroachments, right? Extra constitutional politics.
No, those are very, very interesting thoughts. Ambassador, I'm going to ask you if you have any questions or if you want to throw to the audience here. I'm sure there are lots of questions in everyone's mind. I could talk to you guys all day about this. This is my day off. This is my idea of fun on a day off. But Ambassador, what's on your mind?
We do have a couple of questions from the audience, and I'd like to throw them out for brief answers. One is, aside from Poland, what recent examples are there of reversing state capture? Who would like to take a stab at that? Robert, you sort of know Europe.
I can quickly speak about what happened in Poland, but I'd encourage others and Michael to talk about what happened with the recent elections in South Africa, where the ANC got a bit of a shellacking, right? That could be interesting. But in Poland, you have really the coming together of various opposition parties. So this is interesting because it gets to the point about transcending left and right. You have a very unwieldy coalition under Civic Platform, KO, in Poland, led by the charismatic Donald Tusk, that was able to bring together very disparate political ideologies in Poland under one common denominator, and that common denominator being protecting the Constitution against what was perceived as, and what I would argue was, significant state capture and democratic backsliding at the hands of the Law and Justice Party, who had been in power since 2015. This mostly manifested itself in a very egregious ideological court capture of the Polish Constitutional Tribunal. So putting potential petty partisan differences aside, recognizing the major existential threat to the state by those who would undermine it, galvanizing, fighting back, and winning through an election. It's rare, but it did happen in Poland, and they have a lot of work to do on re-democratizing their society after 10 plus years of significant damage to their institutions.
Michael, you want to talk about South Africa? Very briefly, because we have one more question I'd like to get to.
Yeah, I mean, so from a reversal standpoint, I mean, South Africa obviously had the elections. We saw a change happen. It was one of the main arguments was about corruption and nepotism. And that was one of the driving forces. I mean, there was dissatisfaction with what was being delivered, but the root causes that were ascribed to it, one of them was systemic corruption. And so it did lead to, over a number of elections, you know, a decline in the vote that the single party dominant state got. And in the end, the single dominant state did come to an end. And now there's a coalition that's in power in South Africa.
You need to call it the GNU because it's such a great name, which is a South African animal, but also the Government of National Unity. It's a great acronym.
It's complicated though, because then I have to explain what the Government of National Unity is and how many parties are involved and all of that. So to keep it brief, I'm going to avoid getting into the GNU. But But I will say, when you talk about state capture, if you broaden the aperture, you know, I mean, East Asia, Southeast Asia, those are the examples where you had states that were completely captured, and some of them were authoritarian. And you actually have a case of, like, with Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, where it was a successful state capture for society in many people's eyes. And you know, that's the type of case study that's really problematic for people who do this sort of work, who want to make the argument that state capture is always wrong. You know, Singapore pulled itself out of endemic poverty and a security dilemma that was of epic proportions. And Singapore has emerged as a major player in the world. And I think with small island states and with small states like that, you know, that's where the problematic argument comes in about state capture is always wrong. Some people argue that in those cases, that state capture isn't always wrong. And so that's where academics really need to come in and do the work and be able to show, or be open-minded to the fact that in some cases, maybe, you know, these sort of things actually do turn out to the benefit of the majority. And so I think these are the debates and tensions.
Ambassador, I really hope this last question is from Tupac Shakur, wherever he is.
Unfortunately, he has not revived. But it's a good question. In the context of Soviet and Russian state capture, there's often emphasis on controlling healthcare and education. Are there any examples of this in Brazil, South Africa, and other countries such as Hungary? No one wants to answer that? I mean, I can give a partial
I can say
answer.
something quickly about the education sector. I mean, there's a huge, you know, this, and after Ray, I'm going to, like, basically give this to you because you know all about this. But there was an incident recently happened in South Africa where there was a famous scholar of Zimbabwe affairs who was going to give a speech, and that speech was interfered with. So maybe, Ambassador Ray, you want to talk about that? I think that's a really great example of.
Oh no, I would, and that's exactly the point. I mentioned in Zimbabwe how the ruling ZANU-PF captured the economic and commercial institutions, but one of the things that they also did, which was complicated, in fact, along ethnic lines, was to divert resources from the major health institutions and using healthcare delivery in targeted areas for their supporters and withholding it from those who didn't support them. The education system in Zimbabwe, which was prior to 1980 and for a period of time after, the pride of sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, most African doctors were trained at the medical school in Harare. It became a basket case, and the few independent schools that were there were constantly under threat of what they could have in their curriculum. There were one or two independent schools that tried very hard to reach out and to provide better education. So I think in most cases, I mean, I agree with what Michael said. The term state capture in and of itself is just a term, and Lee Kuan Yew did a good job of capturing Singapore and making it a model for Southeast Asia. So I think as we're talking about it, we need to talk about state capture that does not, in fact, benefit the majority population, which unfortunately happens to be the majority of them, frankly. And I think you'll find in most cases, I noticed this in Cambodia as well. The colleges, the universities, and the schools in Cambodia were basically, I don't know the term, coerced through the offer of resources to run. Their curriculum was indirectly manipulated to benefit the small number of people in the ruling elite who ran the country. And so, yeah, I think in most of these cases, capture primarily of education is a hallmark of the effort to take control of the state and its institutions for the benefit of a small group of people. And that, to me, is the state capture that I think we're really talking about. I mean, Singapore is is probably not a good example because it was a control that benefited the majority, which you know, if you're not ethnic Chinese in Singapore, you'd have another view on that. But that's an unusual case. I think in most cases, when a small group of elite take control of state institutions and the vast majority of the population get no benefit from that, then we need to have something. We need to point it out, and something needs to be done about it. I hope that answered the question. Anyone else like to throw a comment in there before we thank our audience and sign off?
Yeah, I just want to throw in one thing because we haven't talked all about policy, right? And what's happening in the current 119th Congress. And Robert talked about talking to Republicans about what's happening domestically. But globally, the 119th Congress has already shown that there's a appetite for using global Magnitsky Act to go after corruption around the world. And I think that's an important thing for the audience to be aware of. And I don't think there's enough awareness of what's happening. I had a story that appeared a couple of days ago about in South Africa and about the discussions about going after South African elites who were involved in systemic corruption, and that's an ongoing discussion in the United States Congress right now to do that. And it's not just there, it's being discussed in other places. There's a discussion about Solomon Islands, for example. One of the tensions with all of this is that it seems likely they're going to go after countries where they've undermined U.S. national security and foreign policy interests. So there's going to be a selection bias in where these are applied, which also poses a risk because then that's going to lead to a criticism. And so I think this is the whole problem, is that going after systemic corruption actually sometimes benefits, or always benefits some group, right? But it also tends to benefit external groups in some ways as well. And so when you have state capture in a place where, like in Djibouti, where you have a huge U.S. military base, you want state capture because that eliminates all the political risk to the military base. You know, you don't see journalists getting visas to go to Djibouti to cover what's going on at Camp Lemonnier, right? And so there are benefits to state capture even for our own government in other countries. And so I think these tensions, when we talk about state capture, to go back to what Ambassador Ries said, and I end with this, concepts matter. What we're talking about matters, and making sure that we're talking about the right concepts. And, you know, Robert might probably shake his head if I said there's good state capture and bad state capture, because, you know, that just seems like an oxymoron or paradoxical. But that's why we need better concepts. That's why we need to make sure we're talking about the same thing. You know, are we talking about state capture in Taiwan or Korea or Singapore after World War II? Is that state capture? Is that an authoritarian state that turned into democracy? I mean, these are all really important things for us to understand. And I think even amongst people who specialize in political science and specialize in regional studies, oftentimes we confuse ourselves about what we're talking, let alone other scholars in the audience. So I think having clear concepts and making sure we're talking about the same thing really does matter.
Okay, Robert, you can get the last very brief word. Your hand was up and you pulled it down. Did you pulling back, or would you like to say something?
I'll be brief. Just to say that I do agree with Michael that having conceptual clarity is very much needed, and I think it's a worthy debate to have on what exactly do we mean when talking about state capture. One can suggest maybe that the Social Democratic Party in post-World War II Sweden constituted a kind of state capture because, well, quite frankly, it was a one-party state. And it did leave that population with access to social services, healthcare, education, which was remarkable, right? And a net positive, no doubt. So I think it's a worthy conversation to have. The last thought that I had, though, is this question on education, right? The battle over memory politics. Sometimes it's not enough to capture the state as it exists in the present, but to really conquer the past. And this is another concern that I have with the way that would-be authoritarians are dissatisfied only with controlling, right, the politics of today, but also redefining the politics of yesterday. And I'm sure Nancy has a lot to say about that in the Russian context. but perhaps we can talk about that for another day. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. And I want to especially thank Anita for a great job of moderating. You just made my job moderating these things going forward a lot harder. That's a high bar to jump. I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in, and I'd like to point out that this is a special program in more ways than one. This is the first time we've had a panel discussion where we got to all the questions that the audience had. I'm absolutely thrilled that we were able to do that. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, panel, for being with us. Thank you, Anita, for a great job moderating. This recording of this program will be on YouTube in about 24 to 48 hours. All of the audience, all of our panelists are encouraged to share it widely with your networks, because I think what was mentioned here today is something that's worth broadcasting very widely. Again, thank you all, and we'll see you next time.